History remembers kings for their palaces, their riches, and their dynasties. But Tipu Sultan was remembered for none of these. His legacy was born not in luxury but in fire, the fire of battle, of vision, and of defiance. He rose at a time when the subcontinent trembled under foreign ambition, when empires weakened and colonizers advanced like shadows across the land. From this turmoil emerged a boy who would grow into the Tiger of Mysore. Do not think those who are killed in the cause of God are dead. They are alive with their Lord, receiving provision. Surah Al-Imran 3009. Tipu Sultan was born in 1751 in Hyder near Bangalore to Hyder Ali, a man of brilliance who had seized power in Mysore through courage and cunning. Hyder Ali was not of royal birth, but he carved a throne out of strategy and steel. His rise taught his son an eternal lesson: greatness is not inherited, it is earned. From the earliest days, Tipu was trained not as a pampered prince, but as a soldier. His tutors schooled him in Persian, Arabic, and Kannada, but his true classroom was the camp and the battlefield. By the age of 15, Tipu was already riding into skirmishes alongside his father, learning the art of war with blood and dust on his face. He absorbed everything: cavalry maneuvers, artillery placement, siege tactics. Where other rulers' sons lounged in silken chambers, Tipu crouched in trenches, sword in hand. The soldiers who fought beside him spoke of his fearlessness, of how he stood unflinching before gunfire, eyes blazing with a fire rare in one so young. His father, Hyder Ali, fought fiercely against the British East India Company, who were steadily tightening their grip on India. These were no ordinary merchants. They came with ships, muskets, and deceit. They signed treaties with one hand and broke them with the other. Hyder Ali knew it, and so did Tipu. From his father, Tipu inherited not only power but a vision of independence, of resistance against those who sought to enslave his people under foreign rule. When Hyder Ali died in 1782, the mantle fell upon Tipu. He was 31, young by the measure of kings, yet already seasoned by fire. The throne of Mysore was heavy, but Tipu carried it not as a crown of privilege, but as a command of duty. His very first acts as Sultan showed the world who he was. He modernized his army, introducing discipline modeled on European techniques, yet fused with his own innovations. He built foundries to craft weapons, introduced rockets that streaked across the battlefield, and reorganized his cavalry into lightning-fast units. But Tipu was not only a man of war. He was a builder, a thinker, a ruler of vision. He expanded irrigation to make his land fertile, encouraged trade with distant lands, minted coins inscribed with titles that reflected his devotion to justice, and strengthened alliances with the Ottoman Empire and the French. His court buzzed with scholars, artisans, and engineers. He believed that to resist colonization, Mysore had to be strong not just in arms, but in knowledge, wealth, and spirit. Yet the British never forgot him. To them, Tipu was not merely another Indian prince. He was a barrier to their empire, a lion blocking their path. They feared him, respected him, and hated him in equal measure. Where others bent to their will, he resisted. Where others signed away their lands, he fortified his. Where others accepted British dominance, he spat in its face. The first great test of his reign came swiftly. The Second Anglo-Mysore War, begun under Hyder Ali, fell into Tipu's hands. He carried it with ferocity, striking blow after blow against the British forces, reclaiming lost ground and forcing them into treaties they did not desire. His rockets lit up the skies, terrifying enemy soldiers unused to such weapons. His cavalry struck like lightning, appearing where least expected. He became a nightmare for the East India Company, a warrior who combined the discipline of modern armies with the fury of a tiger. But Tipu's defiance made him enemies not only among the British, but also among Indian powers who feared his strength. The Marathas, the Nizam of Hyderabad, and others shifted alliances, sometimes with him, sometimes against him. Tipu understood their games, but his true enemy was always clear: the company whose shadow stretched wider each year. He swore that Mysore would not kneel while he lived. Even as battles raged, Tipu remained a man of personal austerity. He ate simply, wore modest clothes, and worked tirelessly for his people. He was known to rise before dawn, to spend hours inspecting his troops, and to labor late into the night over maps and letters. His palace was not merely a hall of luxury, but a fortress of planning, where strategies were drawn that shook empires. The people of Mysore saw in him a protector. To them, he was not only sultan but soldier, fighting shoulder to shoulder with his men, sharing their hardships, bleeding with them in the dust of battle. His courage was not distant but visible. His presence on the front lines a constant fire that lifted their spirits. They began to call him by a name that would echo through time: the Tiger of Mysore. But history is not kind to tigers. The forests of power are filled with hunters, and every roar draws arrows. Tipu knew that his path would not be one of peace. His reign had begun with battles, and it would continue with storms greater still. The British were not finished with him, nor were their allies. The clash between the Tiger of Mysore and the empire that sought to devour India was only beginning. Empires do not rest when they feel threatened. The British East India Company, shaken by the ferocity of Tipu Sultan, realized that Mysore was no ordinary kingdom and Tipu no ordinary king. He was a warrior who would never submit, a ruler who would never bow. For the company, Mysore became an obsession, the tiger that stood between them and the conquest of the south. For Tipu, the wars against the British became the purpose of his reign, battles not only for land, but for freedom itself. Fight them until there is no more oppression and worship is for God alone. But if they cease, then there is no aggression except against the oppressors. Surah Al-Baqarah 1093, the Second Anglo-Mysore War, had already seen Tipu force the British to terms, but peace with him was uneasy, fragile as glass. Both sides watched each other, sharpening their claws in preparation for the inevitable clash. Tipu, never one to wait for threats to grow, fortified his lands. He strengthened his army with French advisors, forged alliances with the Ottoman Empire, and sent embassies as far as Versailles to seek support. He filled his arsenals with cannons and perfected the rockets that would make Mysore's name feared in Europe. These rockets, iron cased and mounted on bamboo shafts, were no toys. They screamed across the skies with trails of fire, their impact deadly and their terror unmatched. At night, when they lit the heavens, enemy soldiers believed stars had fallen upon them. The British would later study them and carry their design into their own wars. But for now, they were the roar of Tipu's defiance. The Third Anglo-Mysore War erupted with fury. The British determined to break Tipu, allied with the Marathas and the Nizam of Hyderabad, surrounding Mysore with enemies. Against such odds, most kings would have bent, signed away territory, or fled into exile. But Tipu was no ordinary king. He met them with fire. His cavalry struck with lightning speed, harassing their supply lines, cutting off their reinforcements. His rockets rained upon their camps, scattering their lines, breaking their morale. He fought them on open plains, in dense jungles, in sieges that turned their marches into nightmares. Yet the coalition was vast. Mysore stood alone, and betrayal gnawed at its borders. After months of battle, with his people exhausted and his cities under siege, Tipu was forced into negotiations. The Treaty of Srirangapatna in 1792 demanded that he surrender half his kingdom and deliver his sons as hostages to the British. It was a humiliation meant to break his spirit, but Tipu Sultan was unbroken. when he walked into the British camp with his young sons by his side. He carried himself with the dignity of a lion. The generals who faced him admitted that even in defeat, he radiated a strength that silenced them. His sons were taken as hostages. Yet Tipu's eyes did not waver. He was wounded but not destroyed. The tiger had been cornered, but his claws were still sharp. Back in Mysore, he rebuilt with relentless energy. He modernized his administration, introduced reforms in trade and agriculture, strengthened his forts, and prepared once again for war. His sons were eventually returned, but the humiliation of that treaty burned in his heart like a brand. He vowed never again to submit, never again to let his land be torn apart by foreign claws. The British, too, understood that their enemy had not been tamed. They spoke of him in whispers, calling him dangerous, cunning, relentless. To their soldiers, he was a nightmare. To their generals, he was a puzzle. To their empire, he was an obstacle that had to be removed once and for all. The Fourth Anglo-Mysore War loomed, and this time the company was determined to end him. They marched with overwhelming force. Their alliances firm, their resources vast. The armies of the company surrounded Mysore from every side, advancing toward Srirangapatna, Tipu's fortress capital on the banks of the river Kaveri. The siege began with thunder. Cannons roared day and night, pounding the walls, shaking the city, raining fire upon its streets. Inside, Tipu refused to surrender. He walked the ramparts, encouraging his men, sharing their rations, fighting as one of them rather than above them. His presence was fire in their hearts. Better to live a single day as a lion, he declared, than 100 years as a jackal. The people of Mysore stood with him. Women carried water to the soldiers. Children ran messages through the alleys. Smiths hammered weapons through the night. The city became a fortress of resistance, a living roar against the invaders. But the siege was relentless. The walls crumbled under constant bombardment, food grew scarce, and exhaustion gnawed at the defenders. The British pressed harder, knowing the tiger was wounded but still dangerous. As the final assault drew near, Tipu prepared for the last stand. He refused offers of negotiation. He scorned the idea of retreat. To him, there was no life in chains, no honor in submission. His fate would be decided on the battlefield, not in the chambers of diplomats. The storm of war was about to consume Srirangapatna. The roar of cannons grew louder, the walls shook, and the final clash loomed. The Tiger of Mysore sharpened his sword and prepared to meet his destiny. There are deaths that silence a man, and there are deaths that make him immortal. The siege of Srirangapatna in 1799 was not just the end of Tipu Sultan's reign. It was the roar of a tiger who chose death over chains. A moment carved into the memory of a nation as defiance made flesh. And never think of those who have been killed in the cause of God as dead. Rather, they are alive with their Lord, receiving provision. Surah Al-Imran 369. The British East India Company had come with everything. Cannons thundered day and night, tearing through the great fortress walls of Srirangapatna. Soldiers marched in endless waves, their banners flying, their muskets blazing. They were not alone. The Marathas and the Nizam of Hyderabad had allied with them, eager to see the fall of Mysore. Against this storm, Tipu stood with his people, his city, and his faith. Inside the fortress, the air was thick with smoke and dust. The Kaveri River flowed beside the city, but its waters could not quench the fire raining from British cannons. Crops had withered, stores ran thin, and hunger gnawed at soldiers and civilians alike. Yet the spirit of resistance burned stronger than hunger. Women carried water to the ramparts. Children ran with arrows and powder. Artisans repaired weapons by torchlight. The city was no longer just a capital. It was a lion's den, and Tipu was its lion. He did not hide behind walls. Day after day, He mounted the battlements, sword in hand, speaking with his men, sharing their rations, their sleepless nights, their wounds. He dressed in armor, not in silks, and his presence lit fire in the weary. "We'll fight not for land or wealth," he told them, "but for honor. If we die as martyrs. If we live as free men." The siege stretched into weeks, the cannons never resting. Holes widened in the fortress walls, and the enemy crept closer. Still Tipu refused surrender. The British, sensing his defiance, sent envoys with promises of safety if he yielded. He dismissed them with scorn. "I would rather live one day as a lion," he said, "than 100 years as a jackal." Those words were not for rhetoric. They were the creed by which he prepared to die. On May 4th, 1799, the final assault began. The British stormed the breaches in the walls, waves of red, coated soldiers pouring into the city like a flood. Muskets cracked, cannons roared, and screams tore through the smoke. Mysorean defenders fought with ferocity, hurling back the enemy again and again. Streets became rivers of fire. Alleys became fortresses. Every corner of Srirangapatna a battlefield. At the center of the storm was Tipu Sultan. He rode into the chaos, his sword flashing, his eyes blazing. Bullets pierced his armor. Arrows struck his flesh, but he pressed on, striking down enemy after enemy. His horse was slain beneath him, yet he rose and fought on foot, roaring like the tiger whose name he bore. His guards fell around him one by one, but he did not retreat. The fortress shook, but Tipu stood firm. As the sun dipped, the enemy broke through. Amid the crush of battle near one of the fortress gates, Tipu Sultan was surrounded. Still he fought, refusing to yield. A bullet struck him and then another, yet he raised his sword again. A final blow felled him, but even in death his face bore no fear, only defiance. When the British found his body among the slain, his sword still clutched in his hand. Even they bowed in respect. Their enemy had died as a warrior, unbroken. The city fell, but the legend was born. Tipu Sultan had chosen death over dishonor, martyrdom over submission. The British celebrated their victory, but in their hearts, they knew they had faced a man unlike any other. A king who had fought them to the very last breath. In the days that followed, his body was buried with honor, yet his spirit did not rest. His rockets, his innovations, his vision of resistance lived on. The very weapons he pioneered would be studied by the British and carried into Europe, where they would change the face of warfare. The land he defended would one day rise again. His memory carried by patriots who saw in him the first great fighter against colonial chains. Tipu Sultan's legacy is not in the palaces he built or the treasures he held, but in the example he set. He showed that dignity is greater than life, that resistance is nobler than submission, that a man can lose his kingdom but win immortality in the hearts of his people. His story spread beyond Mysore, beyond India, inspiring all who longed for freedom. To the British, he remained a formidable foe. To his people, he became a legend to history. He was forever the Tiger of Mysore. Even today, when the fortress of Srirangapatna stands in ruins, when the river flows quietly past its walls, the ground still echoes with his roar. The stones that witnessed his last stand whisper the story of a man who would not bow, who fought with fire in his heart and steel in his hand. A king who died a warrior, a tiger who never lost his stripes. Tipu Sultan lives not in the dust of history, but in the spirit of resistance. Every time a people rise against tyranny, every time a nation chooses honor over chains, his story is told again. For the tiger may have fallen, but his roar still shakes the earth.